Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone. This is Rishabh Shah. I'm thankful to the Chambers of Siddharth Morarka for giving me the opportunity to speak on the topic of banking laws. Uh, Presently, we are all going through certain extraordinary circumstances, and these extraordinary circumstances have brought in not only a lot of turmoil, but it has affected the livelihood and the living of people in a very large way. Banking, of course, is something on which everybody is dependent. And today's topic is really relevant, looking at the fact that our country is also recently going through a lot of changes in the banking sector. Uh, a lot of new judgments have come in.
Sir,
Therefore, yeah,
sorry for intervening. Sir, your face is only half is visible. Can you please adjust your a little
okay.
bit more? A little bit more.
Meaning this much?
Uh,
Hello?
yes, sir. It's okay.
This is okay?
Yes, sir. But
But okay.
if you can keep a bit far, also it's okay. But your face should be visible because face is only half is visible. That's why.
Okay. Now?
It's only half visible. You're through
Uh,
mobile. You're
okay, wait a minute. What do I do now? How do you?
through mobile
Okay.
or through laptop. You're
Laptop.
just adjust the screen now.
Wait a minute. Um, okay. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. This is okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, shall I continue?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So, hi. So, sorry for the interruption. Uh, Therefore, the idea is there was a discussion between me and Siddharth, suggested that we could discuss banking laws. And therefore, I thought, let me just share my views, thoughts, and experiences in the field over the years. Uh, Fundamentally, the law as it stands today in the area of banking is popularly known as the DRT is a popular court, and the acts which are applicable at the DRT are the Recovery of Debts due to Banks and Financial Institutions Act, and the other one is the SARFAESI Act, which is also very popularly so called, being the Securitization Act. Uh, my idea is first to take you through with the uh, the basic working of the RDDB Act and how it originated, uh, what are the various provisions, how it has evolved over the years. Then after that, my idea is to take you through the SARFAESI Act and its provisions, and of course interspersed with a little bit of case law here and there. And what are the specific unique features of the banking sector? What are the kind of transactions which are looked at in the banking area? So starting with first the 1993 Act, which is called the Recovery of Debts Due to Banks and Financial Institutions Act, now which is now going to be termed as the Recovery of Debts and Bankruptcy Act 1993. Uh, the starting and fundamental point is that usually whenever a bank wishes to recover money, in the good old days, they used to follow the Code of Civil Procedure. And in that, they were required to file a suit in the civil court. In Mumbai, it used to be in the Honorable High Court, a suit used to be filed. And very typically, the prayers in such a suit would constitute seeking a declaration that there is a lawful debt, seeking a declaration that there is a hypothecation of various movables, there is a charge of by way of a mortgage, and for the interim reliefs of court receiver and injunction. Uh, this is how the law was prior to the enactment of the RDDB Act. After the enactment of the RDDB Act, a special tribunal came to be constituted by which the pending suits in the High Court came to be divested and thereafter transferred to the tribunals as they were commenced to be set up in different parts of the country. In Mumbai, the tribunal first came in July 1999. At that point in time, the Debt Recovery Tribunal was located at a place called Vaswani Mansion next to the Oval Maidan near one of the colleges which we have in South Mumbai. And it used to operate out of there. We had three debt recovery tribunals. And the foundation or the basis on which you could file any proceeding in the DRT would be called as the original application. It was not a suit, it was an original application. After filing of the original application, you would then have to get the summons issued The papers would then be served on the other side, and it was more of a summary proceeding in that sense. The proceedings were required to be completed in 180 days. But first and foremost, what kind of applications would be filed in the DRT? The application which could be filed in the DRT would relate to debt. Now, debt is defined under Section 2G of the RDDB Act. Over a period of time, the definition of the word debt has passed through a lot of judicial decision making, legislative amendments, and it has been expanded over the years. And now the definition of the word debt includes not only a claim for money payable in present or in future, but a claim in respect of mortgages, pledges, hypothecation, assignment, or under an award as well. So this is how the definition of the word debt has changed over the years. Several judgments have been passed since 1998-99, whereby the Honorable Supreme Court has given a very expanded meaning to the word debt. And it has said that debt encompasses any kind of a situation where a person owes money to a bank or a financial institution. So after having qualified that the claim of the bank is a debt, the original application could be maintained and filed. In the good old days, until the very recent amendments which have come in, it was only required to file an original application with supporting documents, something like what we do presently in the High Court by filing copies of various exhibits. But now, under the recent amendments, there is a major change, which I will briefly discuss with you. But going further from here, after the definition has undergone such a vast and dramatic change, virtually everything which a bank claims can now go before the Debt Recovery Tribunal. Now, what has happened is that over the years, many kinds of applications have been made, which has led to an evolution of the law. And the law has evolved in terms of joinder or misjoinder of parties, in terms of whether declaratory reliefs can be claimed by a bank or not, which used to be a challenge in the initial years. And now, of course, over time, with experience and with legislative amendments, the law has more or less been standardized. Now, moving ahead, what are we looking at when we file an original application? When an original application is filed, not only does the bank annex all the basic documents, starting with the sanction letter, with the security documents comprising of the demand promissory notes, letters of continuity, waiver letters, hypothecation deeds, mortgage deeds. If there are consortium agreements, even those have to be filed. And also photocopies of the title deeds are required to be annexed to the original application and filed. So this is how the original application used to be filed. And I do remember that in the initial stages, when the DRT was functioning from Vaswani chambers, there were some situations where, in fact, there was cross-examination permitted by the debt recovery tribunals at that point in time, especially when the account statements were not turning out to be very clear, and therefore the evidence of the bank was suffering to an extent. Now, this is so far as the filing goes before the debt recovery tribunal under the RDDB Act. But I must also say that we have to look at certain other provisions. Section 17 of the RDDB Act, it lays down about the jurisdiction of the Debt Recovery Tribunal. Section 19 provides for filing of an original application. And what is important is that there are certain recent amendments which have made the filing of an original application very drastically different, and it respects a certain time frame which has been introduced into the statute. Let me just mention some of these provisions to you. Now, first and foremost, under section 19, subsection 4 capital A, after the summons is served on the defendants, it operates in a manner as a kind of an injunction because the summons itself states so. But now you will notice as we go ahead that under subrules 5A and 5B, after receipt of the summons, the written statement has to be filed within a period of 30 days. Not only is the written statement required to be filed, if there be a claim of set-off or a counterclaim, that too needs to be filed. And furthermore, there has to be a statement of admission and denials for which the matter is to be listed before the Debt Recovery Tribunal. Presently, unfortunately, in the city of Mumbai, we are having a shortage of presiding officers, and there's only one presiding officer out of the three which are tribunals which are presently there. So there has not been a hearing of original applications, which at least I have seen in a long time. We need these posts to be filled faster so that the matters can proceed. So as I was saying, that under the amendments which have now come in, under section 19(5) capital A, the written statement has to be filed in a timeline. Matter gets listed for admission and denials before the presiding officer. And if the admissions are made by the defendant, then it automatically leads to passing off a recovery certificate. If there is a claim of set-off or a counterclaim, to that there would have to be a response by the banks in terms of their written statement or a defense to the set-off. Under Rule 10A, the written statement has to be supported by an affidavit verifying the facts and the pleadings. Now, this is very important. Initially, whenever we would file written statements, there would be a verification clause. And of course, there would be an affidavit in support, which would say in about 2 paragraphs that everything stated in the written statement is true and correct to our knowledge. But now there is a need for filing an independent affidavit, verifying the facts and the pleadings. And until that happens, the written statement may not be accepted as being in accordance with the procedures which have been set down. Now, the affidavit of evidence is also required to be filed along with the written statement. This is something very important. This wasn't earlier there in the statute. And obviously, the idea seems to be to expedite the entire process of completion of pleadings and proceeding ahead with the arguments. Now, at this stage, after the affidavit of evidence is filed along with the written statement, then comes the stage where the interim application, of course, which is filed by the banks along with the original application, would be taken up for hearing. And there are vast powers which are there with the court for the purpose of passing various orders. It could be injunction, it could be restraint from traveling, it could relate to attachment of the property if there is an adequate apprehension which has been made out. So these are the powers which are vested in the presiding officer under subsections 13A, 17, 18. After the original application comes to the stage of final hearing and a final order comes to be passed, what happens next is that a recovery certificate comes to be issued. Now, this is the stage where it is something similar or akin to a judgment being drawn up by a civil court. After the recovery certificate is issued, the matter then gets transferred from the court of the presiding officer to that of the recovery officer. The recovery officer is nothing but something as we would otherwise call it as the executing court. So the recovery officer is the person who is then armed with the recovery certificate, and he is strictly required to follow the mandate of the final order. The recovery officer is then required to issue a notice to the certificate debtors, the ones who have suffered the order of the Debt Recovery Tribunal, and then they are issued a show cause notice. And usually the show cause notice would say that they are required to come and disclose their assets on oath. So other than the secured assets which have been declared for attachment and sale, and if there be any anticipation or a fear that there is a shortfall in the realization after the sale of the mortgaged assets, then there is a need where the recovery officer can direct the certificate debtors. In the case of a company, the principal officers and also the guarantors, who are usually the directors of a company, are called upon to disclose their personal assets on oath. Once disclosed, if anything is really found worth the attachment, then those properties are thereafter attached, and the stage then moves to the stage of valuation, where the bankers are called upon to appoint valuers. Valuation is carried out, and based on the valuation, then ultimately a notice for sale proclamation is drawn up. After drawing up of the notice of sale proclamation, settling of course the advertisement before that, there is a publication which is done. The mode of auction is public auction. Bids are invited. If the bidders do step in, if they come in, then they are allowed to bid. There would be an open public auction. Now, the earlier we used to have a physical public auction being held in the premises of the debt recovery tribunals. But now, of course, with the new guidelines and the e-auction proceedings having stepped in, people, now the courts are veering towards holding e-auctions. So therefore, typically there is an external agency which is appointed for the purpose of holding the auction. And they are the ones who monitor the auction bidding process, and they place the results. Once the results are made known, the highest bidder is discovered. Then the matter comes back before the recovery officer. He is supposed to follow the terms and conditions where he has already deposited the earnest money. Then he is supposed to deposit the balance sum of which completes the 25% of the deposit, and the 75% in accordance with the terms and conditions of the sale within 30 days. So this is how the procedure goes. The amendments which have now specifically come in under subrule 5A, 5B, 10A and 10B, in my understanding seems to be a very, very good introduction in the statute. And the day when the original applications start getting heard by the presiding officers in the debt recovery tribunal, I do believe that all these matters will reach a culmination very, very fast, and the banks and institutions and ARCs will be in a position to, in fact, have their decretal orders faster than later. And this is exactly what the objective of the RDDB Act is. Now, in this entire process, having run through the process very broadly and quickly, what happens is a little more. After the auction is conducted, and if the certificate debtor borrower is unhappy with the result, or where he believes that his property is being sold for a song, what he would usually do is, he is a person who would challenge this. Now, the modes of challenge which are available are under rules 60, 61, 62 and 63 of the second schedule to the IT Act. Now, by virtue of section 29 in the RDDB Act, the provisions of the second schedule of IT Act have been made applicable. Now, what are these rules and what are these provisions? If we, I'm sure all of us have in the course of our working at the courts been to the provisions of Order 21. Order 21 relates to execution proceedings. Now, in Order 21, we have ordered provisions. We have sub-rules 89, 90 and 91. These particular provisions are identical. They are pari materia with the provisions which are to be found in 60, 61 and 62. Now, what basically happens here is these applications are made when the borrower is ready with the deposit of the decretal amount, and he is ready and willing to tender it, and thereby discourage the recovery officer from allowing the sale in favor of the bidder. In other words, he is exercising the right of redemption before the actual sale is concluded. This is under Rule 60. Then under Rule 61 and 62, wherever there has been an irregularity in terms of non-service of notice, or if there is no saleable interest in the property which has been auctioned, the challenges are put up by the borrower based on those rules. So this is what we have in terms of the recovery proceedings. Now, principally, the entire flow of the DRT Act and the rules, DRT Rules 1993, are more or less, they are based on the principles enshrined in the CPC. By virtue of section 22, it is very clearly laid down that the CPC in terms does not apply. But obviously, all of us, we do apply the principles of principles which have been outlined under the CPC as recorded in various judgments. So this is how the procedure works. But now let us turn a little bit to what really goes into an original application in the Debt Recovery Tribunal, and what are the defenses which are set up in the Debt Recovery Tribunal. What happens is that the original application typically has got various averments, and those averments are where the bank says that so-and-so party approached us with an application for a loan. After due consideration of the application, there was a sanction which was accorded. In the sanction letter, there were terms and conditions and what were the nature of the facilities to be provided. And based on that, the party thereafter executed various security documents. The list of the security documents is laid out. After that, the accounts were operated, and then the borrower failed to adhere to the terms and conditions of repayment. And because he failed, there was no possibility of giving any further continuation of the banking facilities. Demand notice was issued, request was made for the purpose of repayment of the amounts. No amounts forthcoming, and therefore it was decided to institute the original application. But this is how the ordinary or a general flow of an original application is. But there's a little more. In Central Bank of India versus Ravindra, reported in AR 2001, Supreme Court page 3098, it has been recorded that the statement of accounts of a bank, they have to be very clear when it comes to the claim for interest. And why so? Because there have been cases where it is found that the statement of accounts are unclear, or there has been a duplication in the charging of interest, or the penal interest which is permitted to be charged has been compounded moreover in the proceedings. So as a result, Supreme Court declared in 2001 that banks are not entitled to claim compounded penal interest. That is something which is totally illegal and impermissible in law. And as a result of that judgment, later on in the Debt Recovery Tribunal, a mandatory averment came to be introduced at the time of filing of the original application, where it was mandatory to aver that there is in fact no charging of compounded penal interest, and therefore that had to be in fact segregated from the accounts, and a separate statement had to be filed to show that compounded penal interest has either been removed or it has been segregated so that it cannot be claimed in the proceedings. Then came the stage where various documents used to be annexed, and there used to be many occasions where documents which were filed by banks and institutions used to be blank. There would be no, they would, in fact, they used to be filed so cursorily at times that it would appall the court completely, because with the blanks over there, it was difficult to determine whether it was an inchoate document or a complete document. Besides, there used to be issues of stamping, there used to be issues of registration in the case of simple mortgages. An equitable mortgage is not required to be registered, though of course now by virtue of an Maharashtra amendment, even that is an issue which is something a pot boiler, and we will have to see how it rolls out now once the original applications start getting heard. But of course, the law will have to be applied prospectively and not retrospectively. So this is how the situation stands. Now, having said this, the last few statements which I just made relate more to defenses which a borrower would take up in the Debt Recovery Tribunal. So his entire focus was either to defeat the document which was filed by the bank by pointing out certain legal loopholes in it by way of stamping, by way of registration, or by way of incomplete or an inchoate document, or in many cases which we have seen, also material alterations in the document. So under Section 87 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, if at all there is any material alteration which is contrary to the interest of the parties concerned, then such a material alteration would invalidate the document, and that is a defense which many would take up. Now, in the times when the matters were being transferred from the High Court to the Debt Recovery Tribunal, there were many cases where parties had filed counterclaims against the bank. And I do remember still that in those initial years when the matters were coming to the DRT, a scrutiny would take place in the department, and all suits and all applications of the defendants which were filed and maintained in the High Court used to be sent back to the High Court, because they would say that the jurisdiction of the Debt Recovery Tribunal is only to hear and entertain the applications of the banks and not of the defendants. Now, this gave rise to a new point to be decided by the courts. As a result, many challenges were taken up, and ultimately, with an amendment in the statute, and of course, a few judicial decisions also, it came to be held that even the counterclaim which were pending already in the civil courts, or if there was a need to file a counterclaim or claim a set-off, by virtue of now provisions which are now contained in Section 19, a defendant can maintain both before the Debt Recovery Tribunal. Now, after that, there was one more challenge which came up on the part of the borrowers, namely the Information Technology Act that amended the Bankers' Books of Evidence Act. The statement of accounts filed with the banker have to be in compliance with the Bankers' Books of Evidence Act. Prior to the IT law having come into the picture, there would have to be a certification of the accounts. The accounts had to be duly certified to say that they were correct and that they were properly maintained in the normal course of banking business. Now, with the coming of the Information Technology Act, especially in the years 99, 2000, 2001, there were too many system glitches. Bankers were not able to convert the physically written statement of accounts into computerized statements. Very often in courts, we would experience that what is manually written down and what is figuring into the computer printout are completely different things. This led to a lot of problems for the bankers. But over a point in time, they would have to get everything converted into the computerized system and bring it before the court. On the other extreme, when we used to have matters, especially when I used to appear for institutions like IDBI, IFCI, CCOM, now they used to have a typical computer system where their accounts would be simply, the entries would be fed into the system and a computer print would be given, whereby the statement of accounts would come in a certain given format. Now, obviously, this given format was not in accordance with the law which subsequently came to be evolved. So for many of these financial institutions, at that point in time, there was a problem. And the problem was, how do you show that the statement of accounts, the entries in the statement of accounts, the entries relating to interest, periodic interest, and penal interest are all in accordance with the law? That was a big, big problem. But obviously, they had to reconstitute the accounts, or they had to rejig the software. Only after doing that were the bankers and financial institutions in a position to tender and file the accounts. It led to a lot of trying times for them, but I believe it was a period of transition. But this remains one of the major challenges, that the certification of the accounts is not in accordance with the law. In fact, there is a judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Chandradhar Goswami in AR 1967 Supreme Court, where it says that merely because the statement of accounts is certified, it does not mean that there is a presumption of sanctity or the correctness of the entries in the statement of accounts. So in other words, those entries had to be proved. In fact, there are two judgments of the Honorable Bombay High Court. Both have been passed by Justice Daga in the year 2008, where in the case of Bank of India or Bank of Baroda, the Honorable Bombay High Court has in fact pulled up the bank's witness for not being familiar or conversant, or not being in a position to depose in accordance with law and establish the documents of the banks and the statement of accounts. So this was, these two judgments have been a landmark in terms of laying down as to how the evidence has to be led by a banker for the purpose of proving it in a court, and what needs to be dealt with. Obviously, you have to pass the test of leading primary evidence, secondary evidence, and now under Section 65A and B, also with the electronic evidence, which has to be proved in a certain manner. The certification which was being done, even post introduction of computerized accounts, was that the chief manager of a branch would basically sign out a certificate, annex it with the statement of account, and then he would say that this is how the accounts are. But if we look at it a little closely, the provisions in the Bankers' Books of Evidence Act, as amended by the Information Technology Act, they lay down as to what are the statements which are mandatorily required to be made in a certificate, and that IT certificate at the same time requires signature of 3 people. One being the person who has actually maintained the computer system, not the accounts, the computer system. The second, the person who puts the entries into those that computer system and software. And third, the branch or the chief manager of that particular branch who would have to sign it. So these are certain subtleties which have to be looked at very carefully. Otherwise, they have an impact on the soundness and the validity of the accounts which have been tendered, and it can affect the claim of a bank. And this is how challenges by defendants from time to time have made the bankers also realize that you have to look at certain things very minutely and present them in a court of law. So this is so far as the challenges go. Now coming to, there used to be and there still are in many original applications currently pending in the debt recovery tribunals, there are promissory notes, there are bills of exchange which have been signed and given as security. Now the stamping on those documents is very often called into question. Then we have a hypothecation deeds, or there are further hypothecation deeds and there are further mortgages. Now those documents have to be looked at from the point of view of stamping and from the point of view of registration as the case may be. These are important factors. So these are broadly speaking the defenses. So under the RDDB Act, we have a procedure which is currently, it has been amended to make it one of the best and the most viable fast track procedures for obtaining recovery certificates. And at the same time, all the objections which used to be taken by defendants earlier have been observed by the legislature. They have tried to remove those hurdles in the way, and they've tried to iron out the creases, so to say, in banking recovery. And the law as it stands currently is, I would say, the best and the quickest way of recovering dues. But now there's something more which happens. Along with the RDDB Act, though it commenced from the year 1993, it remained there for a decade as being the only law for court litigation for the nationalized banks. Then in the year 2002, and looking at the fact that the rising number of NPAs were not really helping in any manner, the Securitization Act was enacted in the year 2002. And with that came a challenge to the constitutional validity, because the provisions in it, as it originally stood, were very drastic. There were pre-deposits contemplated at the stage of Section 17 and 18, amongst many other challenges which were there. But of course, the Honorable Supreme Court of India, in Murdia Chemicals judgment, it struck down certain provisions as being unconstitutional because they were affecting the right of legal redress of a party at the threshold. But when it came to the concept of a pre-deposit at the appellate stage, which is under Section 18, at that point in time, the condition of deposit was maintained, and that continues to rule the ground even today. But now coming back, under the SARFAESI Act, what was the need and what was the reason for bringing in the SARFAESI Act? Naturally, looking at the fact that the recoveries under the RDDB Act were very slow, and still a lot of procedure and ingenuity on the part of the borrowers were delaying the proceedings. So it was now considered that by keeping the bankers outside the courts and giving them an opportunity to either sell off their NPAs to asset reconstruction companies, which would take over the NPA accounts as the stock in trade, and they would pursue the recovery or the management or the revival, as the case may be, of these NPA accounts. In this case, the right of proceeding against the asset, the mortgaged asset, the secured asset, or the pledged asset of the borrowers was given to the banks, and without having to come to court for the purpose of taking an order and then going and effecting recovery, they were permitted for the very first time to stay outside the court and effect their recoveries. So therefore, we have that under the SARFAESI Act, there are the definitions which are given. Now it is noteworthy at this juncture that under the SARFAESI Act, we have the definition of the word borrower. Now, borrower would normally mean only the person who has gone and applied for, obtained, and availed the loan. But in this case, the definition of the word borrower also includes the guarantor and the mortgagor. So the principle of coextensive liability, which we find available under sections 126, 127, 128 of the Contract Act, are typically absorbed and enshrined into this definition here, because all of them are treated at par. Very often than not, the mortgager would be the guarantor himself, the principal borrower would be the mortgager himself, and he would also be a guarantor at the same time. So all were now treated as borrowers for the purpose of proceeding under the SARFAESI Act. Security interest was defined as interest which bankers and financial institutions would have in respect of any asset in which a special security was created in their favor. The definition of NPA was now brought into the statute for the first time by saying that a non-performing asset would be a substandard, doubtful, or loss asset, and these categories of assets would be treated as NPA, and there are certain guidelines for that. The guidelines as in relation to the NPA are to be found in RBI circulars and guidelines. There are master circulars which lay down as to how you have to construe an account becoming a non-performing asset. In the good old days, it used to be about 4 quarters, which was then brought down to about 2 quarters. And finally, as it stands presently, it is a period of 90 days. Now, what happens in this 90 days? In these 90 days, if a borrower is unable to service the account by paying the principal amount, repaying the principal amount, or paying the interest, or both, and there is an overdue position, then the account would be treated as an NPA account. If the borrower enjoyed multiple facilities in which some of the accounts were performing accounts and the others were non-performing accounts, but by virtue of the RBI directives and guidelines, if one account becomes NPA, all of them become NPA. And based on that, the entire account of that particular borrower across all facilities would be declared as a non-performing account. Now, having classified the account of a borrower as a non-performing asset, what would the banker do? The banker then proceeds by issuing a demand notice under section 13(2). Under this section, what we have is a notice is issued under section 13(2), where after setting out the entire history of the banking relation with the customer, it is stated that the outstanding, the outstanding is payable by this particular borrower, and he ought to repay this amount within a period of 60 days, failing which the security assets which are outlined in that particular notice would be proceeded against for the purpose of recovery. Now, the 13(2) notice is mandatorily required under section 13 subsection 3 to mention the details of the amount. Now, judicial interpretation has said that details of the amount actually means that the principal amount and the interest have to be stated clearly facility wise. So if one borrower has enjoyed more than one facility, it is mandatory to spell out the principal amount and interest. There are some challenges which are pending in court where they insist that the date of NPA has to be stated. Now, really, it is not stated in section 13 that it is mandatory to set down the date of NPA in the notice, but as a matter of caution, and because of the fact that classification is already done as an NPA, it is better to set out the date of the NPA and the description of the secured assets as to which assets are meant to secure which of the facilities. So it becomes very clear. After this notice is issued, within 60 days from the date of receipt of the notice, the borrower is required to repay the amount. And when I say the word borrower, please also understand that it means the mortgagor as well as guarantor. Now, once this particular notice is received, they are required to give either their representation or their objection. Now, this is something very important because a representation would mean that a borrower would go back to the bank explaining his problems, his grievances, and saying as to why he deserves time to be given or his account should not be classified as NPA due to a wrongful classification exercise or whatever that might be. But there could also be an objection that this action cannot be taken for certain legal grounds. Now, once this representation or objections are given back to the bank in terms of a reply, the banker is then required to do a very meaningful and a studied exercise and give reasons for either accepting or rejecting any of the grounds which are given. Well, of course, if the reasons are accepted, then there would be a modification in the claim amount or a modification in certain factual statements in the notice, and a fresh one would be issued. But if it is not modified, then what happens is that that notice would stand good and the objections would stand rejected. Over the years, many bankers would give very cursory attention to the objections which were given, and they would just rubbish them in terms of a very short reply and say that none of your objections are tenable and they are rejected. But that would be wrong in law. It is required to deal with each and every ground and give a very meaningful answer to it. The last judgment on this point is the one passed by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of ITC versus Blue Coast. And in this judgment, Chief Justice Bobde, as he is now, and he was there on the bench which passed this particular judgment. It was spelled out that this exercise has to be a meaningful one. Reasons have to be spelled out. It has to be something similar to giving of a reasoned order by a court in respect of any matter before it. So this has become a very important development in this area, and in the speed to recover the monies, where bankers used to recklessly answer back and proceed, that kind of behavior has now been curtailed. So that is so far as it comes to the issue of giving a response to the 13(2) notice and dealing with that. Now this response would have to be given earlier within a period of 7 days. That period has now been extended to 15 days by virtue of amendments in the law. Now, having come up to this stage where the reply is given, and I assume that after giving a meaningful response to the borrower, to the objections and the representations, the bank chooses to proceed ahead. The bank would then ask for a voluntary handover of the secured assets. This would be before considering use of force through the means which are provided in the Act. So if a voluntary handover was not given by the borrower, then the next step available would be to issue a notice, file an application under Section 14 of the SARFAESI Act. And under Section 14 of the SARFAESI Act, they would have to approach the concerned chief metropolitan magistrate or a district magistrate, or in certain cases where it is the collector who has been given the power of exercise the powers of a district magistrate in various places. Now, in this application, it would be mandatory to set out the entire history as to why this application is being made. The magistrate is then enjoined with certain duties. In the application which goes before him, he is then required to look into the application and look for certain specific issues, such as the facilities which are granted, the amounts have been disbursed, the amounts have been availed, the securities which have been created, that there has been a case of a default on the part of the borrower, that the borrower was demanded the payment and he has refused to pay, that there is a valid and subsisting security interest in the properties in respect of which possession is being sought. So looking to that, what would happen is that the magistrate is required to go through this procedure. All these acts are only to satisfy that everything is being followed in accordance with the provisions of the Act. There is no judicial role in the magistrate to decide one way or the other. He is not a person who would be in a position to opine on the validity of a certain document or otherwise. So as a result, what we have is that after doing this scrutiny, an order would come to be passed. Under the recent amendments, now there is a timeline that the order has to be passed within a period of 60 days. This is obviously to expedite the long pending applications which used to languish in the courts here at the CMM in Mumbai for years and years together, and sometimes exasperating the bankers who would then be constrained to approach the Honorable High Court by way of a writ petition seeking a speedy disposal. So all that has been accounted for into the legislative amendment, and idea is to now expedite the passing of the order to take possession. There has been very recently, when we had our earlier Chief Justice who demitted office from Mumbai, ex-Chief Justice, Justice Nandara Jog, in one of the writ petitions, there was an issue which came up before him where the issue was whether the possession of the asset could be taken by any person who was not designated by the Chief Metropolitan Magistrate. Section 14 says that the CMM or the DM or any person nominated or designated by him would alone have the right to go and take possession of the assets. Now, these people would obviously be the officers of the court, but a procedure was involved where there was a panel of various commissioners which was set up. Idea was to meet the increasing demand of commissioners who would go and take possession. In one matter of G Exims, Chief Justice Oak, as he is now, as he then was in Mumbai as Justice Oak, he had said that there is nothing which prevents the appointment of commissioners from going and taking possession of the assets, though there is no specific provision in the statute. But Chief Justice Nandrajog, he said that this is definitely something not provided for in the statute, and we have to read the statute as it stands. The plain grammatical ordinary meaning has to be applied. And if the law says that it is only the chief judicial magistrate or the officers appointed or designated by him who can take possession, then it will be only those category of people who are entitled to go and take possession and none else. So as a result, now again, the entire process has come to a grinding halt in that sense, because now the role goes back to the registrars of the court who would have to be appointed, and they will have to bear the increasing burden of going and taking physical possession. So this is so far as the entire issue of taking an order of physical possession under Section 14 is concerned. Then after this order is passed, and by then most of the borrowers are pretty, I would say, pretty smart now, because they also keep a track of what is being done by the bankers. They keep a track of the applications, and they are just waiting as to when they should be going and approaching the court. So after this order is taken, the borrowers then have a right to go and file an application under Section 17. Of course, let me caution everyone at this stage that the right to approach the Debt Recovery Tribunal challenging the bank's action under the SARFAESI Act is something which can happen at any stage, because there are some judgments which say that every act starting from issuing a 13(2) notice under the SARFAESI Act is one of the measures which is taken under the SARFAESI Act. And because that be a measure, then even before the physical possession is taken, there is a right inuring in every applicant to approach the court under Section 17. So as a result, but mostly what happens is that the DRTs are keen on entertaining applications only if there was a real threat of losing physical possession. So this brings us to the stage of Section 17. Under Section 17, an application can be filed by any person aggrieved. Any person aggrieved is someone who would be aggrieved by any of the measures taken by the banks and their officers for taking physical possession. These words have received judicial interpretation, and there are very recent, even in Agrawal Tracom, a judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, where in the course of a sale conducted under the SARFAESI Act, a dispute arose between the bidder for the property and the bank. Now, obviously, the bidder approached the courts, and then the issue arose whether he was a person who was aggrieved by the action of the bank. Ultimately, the matter travels up to Supreme Court, and a decision is given that, well, if it relates to any of the measures which was taken by the bank, based on which the bidder is having a grievance, then obviously he has a right to file a Section 17 application. So we should not construe the SARFAESI Act in such a narrow manner to say that it involves only the borrower and the banker on the other side. It need not be that. It could be any person who is connected in the entire judicial process under the SARFAESI Act. So having said that, under Section 17(1), you will then have the right to file an application challenging that there was something wrong with the 13(2) notice, that the account was not an NPA and it was wrongfully classified. The representation of the borrower has not been duly considered. The objections have been ignored. And based on this, the party, or ultimately, there would also be a right to say that the asset which is being proceeded against is in fact not a secured asset. And for that, the Section 17 application would then be argued. Now, interim orders is something which is in the nature of preventing any further steps being taken. There is never an opportunity, or there is never an occasion where the DRT would proceed to hand back possession of the property at the interim stage. It never happens. What is required to be done is you can at the most halt the steps being taken by the bankers, in the process, but you cannot dislodge them completely and say that you can get possession at the interim or the ad interim stage. Having said that, the matter has to then proceed to final hearing after filing of replies. That again is a slightly tardy process. It is not moving as fast as it should. But be that as it may, there is a lot more which has to be done. Now, the process and the manner in which the action has to be taken by the banker or the ARC needs to be spelled out in a little detail. Now, we have under Rule 2A of the Security Interest Enforcement Rules, the definition of the word authorized officer. And it says very broadly that the authorized officer cannot be a person below the rank of a chief manager of the branch, and it has to be anybody from him and above, but not anyone who's below that. So that is so far as the authorized officer is concerned, who has the right to start issuing the 13(2) notice, and he is specifically empowered to act on behalf of the bank or the institution. And then under Rule 3, there is the 13(2) notice has to be issued in three modes, three typical modes. The first mode is by registered post AD, which is the conventional method. It also says by hand delivery. And the third, which is now recently brought into under the amendment, is by electronic mode. So the electronic mode of service is in addition to the mode of service, which is by RPAD and by hand delivery. This is to ensure that the grievance of the borrower, which they would earlier take that I never received such a notice, there is no proof that it was delivered at my address, and so on. So all those possible defenses are obviated and they are moved out of the picture. And after that, after the delivery of the notice to be done in accordance with Rule 3, then we move to the stage where possession of the movables has to be taken. When the possession of the movables has to be taken, a notice has to be given in advance, fixing a certain stipulated date. And on that particular date, when the possession is taken, then there is a need for drawing up a panchnama and an inventory. Panchnama has to consist of two independent witnesses who would sign it, and an inventory of all the various items which have been taken over need to be specifically and clearly listed out. This is very important. This has to be done mandatorily. There are forms which are given at the end of the Security Interest Enforcement Rules 2002, which have to be complied with because those formats are statutorily provided. Post that, once the possession is taken, then comes the stage of valuation. Those assets would then have to be valued. And after the valuation exercise is done, there comes the concept of fixing of reserve price. Now, reserve price can be fixed in consultation by the authorized officer with the bank. This is permitted under the law. Post fixing of the reserve price, there has to be a 30 clear days notice of sale provided to the borrower. And again, the mode of service can be in either of the ways. It can be given by hand delivery, it can be by registered post AD, and it can be by the electronic mode of service. And then the properties can be put to sale. Now, something slightly different and unique. What are the various modes of sale which is permissible? Now, right now we are talking about only the movables. So the modes of sale which are permissible are one, first and foremost, and the most popular and accepted method is the mode of public auction. Then it is by inviting various intentions of interest from various parties. Tenders are invited. Then comes a stage where there is, you can also then seek, one is, just give me a moment, please. I just, sorry. So one is by obtaining quotations. The next is by inviting tenders. Public auction is the first mode, and the last being by private treaty. So sale by private treaty of movables is permissible under Rule 6 into brackets 2, sub rule 2, of the security interest enforcement rules. Now, if the first round of auction fails, then the banker would then have to obviously go for the second round. Now, in the second round, it is not required to give a 30-day sale notice. The sale notice is curtailed to a period of 15 days. But of course, one has to go through the rounds of publication of those notices also in newspapers, one in English and in the vernacular, as was to be done at the first stage. And this is something which has to be done: adequate publicity, transparency, and an opportunity for the borrower to know at every stage as to what is happening to his property, which is now being taken over by the bank to enforce their rights. Now, this is so far as the procedure for movables goes. Then we turn to the procedure for sale of immovable property. So here we have rules 8 and 9 of the security interest enforcement rules, which come into the picture. It follows more or less the same procedure insofar as we have just discussed about the movables. And once again, possession notice has to be issued, a date has to be fixed, and post that, on the date fixed, the immovable properties are taken over. It follows the same route once again. A valuer is appointed, a valuation report is to be made, and the reserve price is to be fixed. And ultimately, it goes through the same round of a 30 clear days sale notice, which has to be given to the borrowers. And in this case, once this notice is given, it is in a way to say that this is the final opportunity which is being given to the borrower to come and redeem. It is adequate publicity and bringing to the knowledge of the borrower that he still has an opportunity to salvage and save his properties and assets. So after this, once the property is then put for sale, the properties would again go through those 4 different rounds: invitation of tenders, inviting quotations, public auction, or by private treaty. Now, private treaty is something which really fascinates me here, because now the statutes for the first time have given a big role to play to the concept of private treaty, and something which I also agree with, because this is one of the fastest ways in which banks and institutions will be in a position to effectively conclude sale of the property and realize their monies. Now, what happens here is that when these particular assets are being sold by private treaty, it is very important to note that a sale by private treaty earlier used to be done by concurrence in writing and consent of 3 parties. And who are those 3 parties? The authorized officer, the secured creditor, and the borrower. But as we've seen, it is quite natural that a borrower would never agree with the consent for sale by private treaty, because he would apprehend that he is losing value of his property. And therefore, in most cases, and even otherwise, just for the sake of opposing, he would never agree. As a result, what we now have is that these provisions were amended. So we had the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, where Justice Lodha was a part of that bench in the case of Siddheshwara, Iqbal versus Siddheshwara. And in that, this particular rule was the subject matter of interpretation. The statute was thereafter amended, and now a sale by private treaty is only by way of discussions between the purchaser and the secured creditor, obviously acting through the authorized officer. So this is one major development which has taken place. And usually when parties approach the DRT under a Section 17 application with the rush for seeking an injunction, this is the injunction which they want, that they should not be allowed to sell it by private treaty, because if a private treaty is something which happens within the 4 corners of the bank's walls. So we really do not know if, say, for example, a borrower does not get an order of ad interim injunction or an interim injunction, or it gets so onerous that he cannot comply, the bank may probably be sitting with a person and a private treaty can be concluded. And there is nothing wrong in that. This is something which the law permits and can be taken advantage of. But this is something which is a major development, and obviously it is in the direction of expediting the recovery. So that is so far as the modes of sale under the SARFAESI Act are concerned. Now, after this comes the issue there was another chapter that once the successful bidder and the highest bidder was found, there would be a problem as to when he would have to deposit the amount. Now, originally, I mean, the way Rule 9 was worded, the idea was that he would have to deposit the 25% amount as soon as the auction was declared in his favor. Now, that became a little difficult and impossible for any bidder to comply with, because very often, say for example, the sale was taking place at 5 in the evening and he was not in a position to bring the 25% payment. That used to be a matter of challenge by the borrowers to say that, look, he has not strictly complied with the letter of the law. And in the judgment of Matthew Varghese, the Honorable Supreme Court has very emphatically stated that these are extraordinary powers which are given to banks. So the compliance with the letter of the law has to be very strict. And if the monies are not deposited instantly at the end of the auction sale, then the sale must be declared as having failed. Now, these used to be the initial challenges. This has also traveled and been taken into account by the legislature. And the legislature has said that the amounts can be deposited on the same day, or it could be the next working day. So this helps to resolve a lot of impossible situations from the bidder's point of view also. Now, having said that, before the amendment to the SARFAESI Act, the balance 75% payment had to be made by the 15th day. Now, by the 15th day, it was quite difficult for many of them at time to bring in the money, and they would be staring at a consequence, which was forfeiture. So the amounts which they had deposited would be forfeited to the banker, and neither would the borrower get the advantage of this money, because this was not to be treated as something towards part repayment of the loans or anything. So the statute once again has been amended to provide for a total period of 3 months. But this period of 3 months is the subject matter of an agreement in advance in writing between the bidder and with the authorized officer. So this is how it stands insofar as the procedure is concerned. Now, under the SARFAESI Act, we had a different category of people who were coming into the picture. And these were the tenants or the lessees. In this regard, there has been a lot of discussion, because there was perceived to be a clash between two different kinds of laws. One was the recovery law under the SARFAESI Act, and the other was a conflict with the provisions of the various state rent acts. Now, in this case, the Honorable Supreme Court has also, Justice Chelumeshwara, in his very famous judgment, he has considered, and he has also outlined the fear that very often the provisions of the SARFAESI Act would be abused. They would be abused by the banks and institutions to oust genuine tenants who were occupying the property, probably much before the facilities were taken, and they would as a result suffer at the hands of the bankers, and they would be ousted from the property. The right to property has been declared to be a human right. It has been declared to be a constitutional right, though of course it is no longer a fundamental right. Since this is the scenario, it is very important to protect these rights to the extent it is possible. As a result, what has now happened is that there was the first judgment in the case of Harshad Sondangar, in which the Honorable Supreme Court classified the 3 categories. And those 3 categories were about whether the tenants were there prior to the availment of the facility, whether the tenants were there after availing the facility but before the 13-2 notice was issued, and the last category, whether the tenants were brought in after the 13-2 notices were issued. The first 2 categories were called valid ones. The last category was out and out invalid and illegal in law. That was the judgment in 2014 in the case of Harshad Sondangar. Then it brings us to the case between 2014 to 2016, remains a slightly turbulent period where tenants would vie to show before the court that they are genuine, that they have not been introduced or inducted into the premises for the sake of thwarting the claim of the bank. Therefore, in 2016 came another judgment from the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Vishal Kalsaria. And in this, it was clarified that even if we are to look at a claim for a tenancy or a lease, it would be important to see whether there is registration being done or not, and it is not a blanket protection which is given to the tenants, but it would have to be examined in the light of specific criteria. So this was the judgment in the case of Vishal Kalsaria. After this, there is an amendment in the statute, and under section 17(4)(a) of the amended section 17 of the SARFAESI Act, the tenants who would earlier approach small causes court in the city of Mumbai or in other places where they would approach civil courts and obtain orders of injunction. Now, all those class of tenants, licensors, licensees, and the lessees are now required to approach the debt recovery tribunal whenever any action is taken under the SARFAESI Act, and they have to establish that they are in fact genuine tenants. Appendix 10, which has now been introduced by virtue of the amendment, at the end of the security interest enforcement rules, it lays down as to what has to be shown to the debt recovery tribunal for the purpose of satisfying the court that the tenants are genuine tenants or not. In fact, there is a judgment of the Honorable Bombay High Court in the case by Justice Phansalkar Joshi, where in the course of one such case, she has elaborately explained as to what are the criteria, what is it that has to be shown by a genuine tenant. Only then he would be accepted at a prima facie stage in order to get the protection. Now, this is what is the position now. And obviously, what are the parameters? Any genuine tenant who occupies a premises would have the following things. Obviously, he would have a rent note, and a rent note which would be given to him from time to time. A rent receipt would be given to him from time to time. After that, if it is a tenancy after the Maharashtra Rent Act came into effect, then in such a case, okay, I'll deal with the questions. I'm seeing some questions popping up. I'll just come back on this. So coming back, that other than the rent receipt, he would also be using the premises. Premises are of two kinds. It could be a residential property. It could be a commercial property. If it is a residential property, then obviously it has got, besides electricity, telephone, receipt of correspondence, and for gas purposes, certain entries that there is a gas book which is written out at that particular premises, and so on and so forth. So this is so far as residential premises go. In case of commercial properties also, more or less the same kind of documents would be required to show that there is a commercial usage of the premises. So this is what was laid down by the Honorable Bombay High Court in the judgment. Now, this is so far as the claim of the tenants is concerned. The latest one, in the case of Bajrang Agarwal, which was about a year ago, the Honorable Supreme Court has then indicated about a tenant at sufferance. The concept of a tenant at sufferance is a person who holds over post determination of the lease period and how he has to be treated or dealt with, whether he enjoys any special protection or not. So these are three major judgments when it comes to the claim of a tenant or a lessee in respect of premises under the SARFAESI Act. So this is so far as the proceedings go under the SARFAESI Act. Other than this, I would quickly want to touch upon a few other areas. Other than these two acts which are available, we also have in place Multi-State Cooperative Societies Act. Now, Multi-State Cooperative Societies Act applies to banks which are registered under this particular, they are incorporated under this act and they have a banking license, and they cater to members who are spread out across different states in the country. They are allowed to operate in many states. Now, typically, as it happens, there is the structure of officers under this act is that the central government appoints the central registrar. He is the one who is concerned with the day-to-day regulation, supervision, management of the multi-state cooperative banks, issues various guidelines, circulars which are required to be followed. Under section 84 of this particular act, the registrar, he has a right to appoint an arbitrator. Now, multi-state cooperative banks, they enjoy additional remedy, which is to avail the remedy of arbitration in the event of recoveries to be effected from the borrowers. So once an arbitrator is appointed by the central registrar, then the procedure and mechanism of arbitration obviously would continue under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. There is a separate provision for limitation under the Multi-State Cooperative Societies Act. It does not strictly follow the limitation of filing of a money claim or which is a period of 3 years, but there is a slightly longer period which is provided under the Multi-State Cooperative Societies Act. So after the central registrar appoints an arbitrator, the arbitrator would then have to proceed with the arbitration in accordance with the law. He passes the award. The award then, if required to be challenged, it goes before the district court in other places and the High Court at Mumbai by way of a Section 34 challenge, and so on and so forth. So this is so far as the multi-state cooperative banks are concerned. One word I would like to mention here is that multi-state cooperative banks are one such category of banks which I believe they have been blessed with multiple remedies and approaches which are available, and which is they not only have a right to invoke statutory arbitration, they can also file an original application in the under the RDDB Act. They can adopt proceedings under the SURFACI Act, and if they have an independent and other, so these are the basic approaches which are available to a multi-state cooperative bank, which are not otherwise available to nationalized banks or scheduled banks. Therefore, in that sense, multi-state cooperative banks appear to be a little more favored in terms of the number of remedies available to them. Then coming to the level of the state, we have the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies Act. Under the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies Act, there are twofold remedies which are available. One is under Section 91, where a dispute application is filed before the cooperative court, which are formed under the Act. And the other is a quicker summary procedure under Section 101 of the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies Act, where recovery proceedings are initiated before the registrar. After a hearing is given before the registrar, and ultimately it results in the passing of a recovery certificate, the recovery certificate may be challenged. If it is challenged, then the next step after the issue of recovery certificate is a revision under Section 154. Now, even under this procedure for revision, what happens is that it has to be filed before the divisional joint registrar. There is a mandatory condition of deposit of 50% of the amount. Of course, the borrowers try to bypass this by approaching the Honorable High Court and seeking some kind of a stay or interference under Articles 226 and 227, which is more often than not it is rejected and it is not allowed. After that, we have the stage where if the revision fails, then it permits the banks to initiate and continue with recovery. Under Sections 156, read with Rule 107 of the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies rules, there is an elaborate setting out of provisions where the state cooperative banks, they can proceed and they can go ahead with the execution and recovery of their amounts. Now, under Rule 107, it is more or less the entire Rule 107 is virtually and principally it borrows from Order 21 of the Code of Civil Procedure, and it follows more or less the same pattern. But with some recent amendments, what has happened is when the cooperative bank seeks to take physical possession of the borrower's property, even they are now directed to approach the magistrate's court and take the order. And the second glitch, which I perceive is there in the way of the cooperative banks, is that they are then required to settle the valuation report in discussion with the registrar. Now that I believe is a little onerous on cooperative banks, because the registrar is himself burdened with so many cases. There is a paucity of time and genuinely delays the recovery action of the bank, who have virtually come to a stage where they have the possession of the property, they have to await the nod on the valuation and then proceed ahead. Now this is broadly speaking the procedure under the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies Act. Now we have a lot of connected acts which have a deep connection with these procedural statutes. I wish to quickly run over them. And of course, a few banking products which are very unique and which we will never find getting debated or argued in any other court, because everything in banking then comes only before the Debt Recovery Tribunal. But turning first, we have I wanted to highlight particularly the provisions of sections 21 and 35 capital A of the Banking Regulation Act. These two sections are critical because they have been noticed time and again by the highest court in the country. And these sections are the ones which permit the Reserve Bank of India to issue various guidelines, circulars, and directions to banks and to for the purpose of making the banking system run in a very coherent manner. Now, these guidelines under these specific provisions are stated to be statutorily binding, and they have to be mandatorily followed by the banks and institutions. This this discussion was first done in the case of Central Bank of India versus Ravindra, and down the line in Sardar Associates in 2008, and thereafter it has been repeatedly been followed. So these two sections, 21 and 35 capital A of the Banking Regulation Act, these are very important from a banker's perspective. Then turning to the provisions of the Reserve Bank of India Act, of course, not that they are directly called into question, but there are a couple of things. Reserve Bank of India, being the premier banking institution in the country and the watchdog of the entire economy, very often the Reserve Bank of India does not part with certain relevant banking information, which many people seek as regards the functioning of banks or with the manner in which certain transactions are called into question. This issue arose in the case of one Jayantilal Mistry. And there was a certain challenge under RTI which he had laid, and he was seeking information from the RBI, which the RBI rejected the application, saying that, sorry, this cannot be done. Supreme Court comes to the aid and says that, sorry, if this is information which is not affecting public interest or the security of the country, there is no reason why the bank, the premier bank of the country, can be transparent enough in disclosing and giving information to the public, because now the concept has changed. Now even the banks are sought to be monitored, supervised, watched, and they are also being called into question. So this, I believe, is the trend of decision presently so far as the RBI is concerned. Now turning to a few specific products. In the Debt Recovery Tribunal, it's been quite some time since we argued this concept many years ago. There are letter of credit facilities. Now here I don't mean by guarantees which are given in by the bankers and all that. Pure letter of credit facilities, where what happens is that an Indian borrower who may be probably importing goods from abroad. So you have the seller who is a foreign seller, you have the purchaser who is an Indian party, and this Indian borrower requests the bank that I need to have a letter of credit issued in favor of the foreign seller so that I can receive the goods and then I will pay for those goods to you. In the international banking system, especially in international trade, the letter of credit forms the safest and the surest way of carrying out international transactions. So therefore, in many of the matters where letters of credit were issued, and of course there were defaults, and that is how the matters came to the Debt Recovery Tribunal, there used to be issues as regards the kind of letters of credit which were issued. One was whether it was a letter of credit at sight or whether it was a usance letter of credit. Both are slightly different. A letter of credit at sight basically implies that as soon as the documents which are received by the bank is required to scrutinize those documents, and if once they are found to be in order, the liability is accepted, then the payment has to be made. But in the case of a usance LC, what happens is that after accepting the liability, there is a certain time period provided for discharging the liability in respect of the monies under the letter of credit. So it used to be about, say, 30 days or 90 days, and this would usually happen in the gems and jewelry sector. This is the manner in which most of the transactions used to happen. So these were some very unique kind of transactions. In some of them, the UCP-DC 600 was invoked. Of course, prior to UCP-DC 600, now let me say what is UCP-DC.
that is Uniform Customary Practices of Documentary Credits. Earlier, till the year till July 2007, there used to be UCPDC 500. Then after July 2007 came the series of UCPDC 600. Now, what exactly is UCPDC? These are international norms which have been laid down by the ICC. And based on this, the business of letters of credit is followed based on an established code of conduct. Under the UCPDC, the provisions are of what kind of documents have to accompany, which have to be sent across from one country to another. Typically, there are two kinds of banks. One is the LC opening bank. The other bank is the negotiating bank, which is the counter bank. Documents are sent across. And once documents are sent across, after that, a scrutiny has to be done. If there are any objections to the documents not being in accordance with the terms of the letter of credit, those objections had to be conveyed in a specified time and period. And after compliance with those objections, the transaction would go ahead and be completed. Now, we have had an opportunity of arguing these in respect of LC facilities at the Debt Recovery Tribunal, and this has been a very unique opportunity for many of them to look into this area of the law, which is no longer available as a matter of argument anywhere else across the country, or in at least in the litigation field. Maybe in arbitrations they still are. Then there was another kind of an issue where we had to face the issue of insurance. Whenever the ECGC credit, whenever there were exports which were conducted, and the ECGC, which is a premier institution which provides insurance to bankers for various exported goods to a certain extent, whenever any transaction failed or the monies did not come, the insurance policy would be invoked. Bankers would submit documents and recover about 70, 75, 80% of the insured amount from ECBGC, but that was coupled with a condition. And the condition was that they would have to recover the monies from the borrowers. Now, the general impressions borrower would carry is that once the bank has recovered the money from the insurance company, their liability is discharged. But that is unfortunately incorrect. It does not happen so, because otherwise this would give a kind of a premium to various people to allow the exports to fail, and thereafter tell the bank to go and recover their monies from ECGC and close the whole chapter. But that is incorrect. Now, there are two Delhi High Court judgments on this point which say that even after the ECGC provides the insurance money, it does not discharge the liability of the borrower, and the ECGC is meant to only protect the bankers and not absolve the fundamental liability. So this is how the law in regard to ECGC claims also has been. Well, we still have to see a lot of the original applications come to final hearing. That would really bring out many aspects of the law, which unfortunately has not been developed adequately in the country as yet. So this is so far as these issues go, these products go. Now, turning to certain other claims, I deliberately did not go into the provisions relating to appeal under the RDDB and the SARFAESI Act, because the channel is typically there from the trial court. We proceed to the appellate court, and there are conditions for deposit. Now, of course, under both the acts, there are conditions for deposit. Earlier, it was non-existent in the case of RDDB Act, but of course, that was a lot of procedure. But my idea was to basically give across the concept of how banking laws are working in our country. We also have, at a parallel, the Banking Ombudsman scheme. Again, there is a lot of wrong impression which people carry that, well, we can probably approach the Banking Ombudsman and have our grievances settled. Well, the Banking Ombudsman is that's a special category which has been set up, and under the scheme, one of the existing officers designated by the RBI, he functions to resolve banking facilities as they are in operation. You cannot go over there complaining that the banker did not behave properly, or he is the one, he denied a certain right of mine. For that, the established courts are the ones which will decide it. But it is not the banking ombudsman, because people speak a little unknowingly about the concept of a banking ombudsman. So therefore, that needed to be clarified. Today, bankers are also being dragged to a large extent to consumer courts, and there are plethora of judgments. But again, they pertain at a very micro level, where an individual who has been denied a facility or who has suffered some loss at the hands of the bank, be it a loss of documents, a loss of monies, or non-service or of not being provided certain facilities as would be expected by a party. This is the area of consumer courts for those limited micro level issues and problems. But as we stand today, this is how the banking law exists. The most recent development would be very important. We have the judgment in the case of Pandurang, which has been passed by the Honorable Supreme Court. A 5-judge bench resolved a long-standing issue, and namely, that was the issue of whether or not the cooperative banks have a right to proceed under the SARFAESI Act. After tracing the origin of the source of power under List 1, Entry 45 of the Constitution of India, insofar as the power of passing laws relating to banking are concerned, that vests with the central government, then a comparison was made with List 2, Entry 32, which is in the state list. And after comparison of these two provisions, it was ultimately found out. And after interpreting Section 5 and Section 56 of the Banking Regulation Act, it was clarified that the central government does have the power of allowing these cooperative banks also to effect recoveries under the SARFAESI Act, because recovery constitutes one of the activities which a bank will do for the purpose of carrying out banking. That is the sum and substance of this particular judgment. It has been very elaborately and very plainly and very well put down. So it puts to rest a lot of controversy. It's a tremendous boost for cooperative banks also, because many cooperative banks were finding themselves held up when it came to the procedure to be followed under Rule 107. There used to be many glitches, but now with this having been clarified, many cooperative banks will be able to use the provisions of the SARFAESI Act to their advantage, and probably faster. So this is, broadly speaking, the concept of the banking laws as they prevail. And this is the area and arena where the rights and liabilities of people in the banking law and sector get determined. So I would thank, first of all, Mr. Murarka for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I found the topic a little broad, but I was quite happy. But there was so much to speak, and there's so much of data still to be spoken about. But unfortunately, I'm not able to do all of that. I thank you very much. I've had very good able assistance from my juniors, Anuja Bansali. I need to name them: Sakshi Sabu, Anshul Anjarlekar, Sayyam Maheshwari, Rishabh Vakharia. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm ready to take up any questions if there are any, please.
Yes, sir. There are some questions.
Yeah.
I will take it one by one.
Sure.
First question is from Shreya Deshpande. Her question is, sir, with
Yeah.
the recent Supreme Court judgment about cooperative banks can proceed under SARFAESI as well as recovery, can you throw light on this? What changes it will bring in practice?
The changes, as I see it, is that it will enable the cooperative banks to to take steps under the SARFAESI Act, and many of the borrowers who had taken up the ground, especially when it came to cooperative banks saying that they don't have a right to approach the DRT, that ground has now gone. So in a way, it will help the cooperative banks recover faster.
Next question is from Nikhil Jangir. His question is RDDB not applicable to NBFCs? As for some NBFCs, SARFAESI Act is applicable, but whether RDDB Act is applicable or no?
They would require specifically to be covered under the RDDB Act. They would require to be a bank. Now, NBFCs, by virtue of their very constitution, they are non-banking finance companies. So in that sense, though they can probably act as private ARCs, by getting a license from RBI under the SARFAESI Act, they cannot come under the RDDB Act because they are not a bank or a banking institution, and they are not carrying out any banking activity.
Next question is, same time possession of movable and immovable not possible under law.
Sorry, same time?
Possession of movable and immovable not
Uh.
possible under law.
Well, it can be. I'm just hypothetically, I assume to answer this question, I would say that if there are people who are, say, for example, a factory, and the bank has got the security in the factory and the goods lying in the factory. So it is very much possible that you can simultaneously take possession of both the movables and immovables.
There is one more question from Nikhil Jangi. This question is, if the borrower files an appeal under Section 18 of the SARFAESI Act, so whether it is compulsory upon the borrower to deposit 50% of the outstanding amount before the DRET or any relaxation is provided?
I believe now with the amendment to the RDDB Act, there is a mandatory requirement of some deposit, 25 or 50%. That's what the law says. It has been now clarified by virtue of the recent amendments. So earlier it used to be squad free. There was a provision where the appealing party may probably get a complete waiver, but not anymore. Now they are mandatory required to deposit.
Okay, with this we conclude our webinar of today.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on today's topic. It was indeed a very informative session for all of us. We are looking forward to have many more sessions by you in the near future. And I would also like to thank all the participants who have attended today's webinar. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.